Hi, welcome to another drawing video by me, I guess your host, Adam Gorham. Today I'm going to be drawing on yet another Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 100 sketch cover. This guy is blue, so I'll be drawing Leonardo. You can see that I've done a rough drawing on the cover already, and I've chosen to go with Leonardo in the very inconspicuous trench coat and fedora look to walk about the streets of Midtown. I think that they did this in the first movie, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I've actually watched those films, but I was just trying to think of, I don't know, something interesting to draw for this cover, because I've done a few of them and I've done, static, busts and whatnot, but I've, felt like doing something maybe a little moodier and a little unconventional. And I think that showing the turtles in kind of a, I don't know, more of a civvies look could be fun. So that's what I'm going to do today. And one of the first things that I'm going to do is break out some markers, which I haven't done, which I don't do all that often. When I do use them, they're usually, like one solid color for accents or whatever. I don't tend to do fully finished rendered pieces in marker, especially for commissions, because I believe that since these markers are alcohol based, they're not archival, so I don't know what their shelf life is like. But for this, it seemed like a fun experiment. And I'll be using them to kind of reinforce this city at night vibe that I'm going for. And I'm putting them down first because what I find is when I've done an ink drawing and then add color in with the Copics afterward, the alcohol in the markers sometimes causes my ink to bleed, which is always really annoying and frustrating, especially if it's a piece that I have been a little particular with in terms of inking. So I've learned to kind of treat this in almost a painterly fashion where, when you're painting, you start with the background and then you go forwards. So in this case, I'll be laying down the colors beforehand and inking afterwards. But it should be fun. So first I'm laying down this blue to show that it is our guy, Leo. There we go. And now I'll just be adding some, what I'm suggesting are background lights in the distance on a rainy night in New York. Let's see here. I'm just sort of spitballing the perspective. It's possible that using these markers in a sealed room with the door shut and the windows closed is maybe not the best idea in terms of the quality of air that I'm breathing in. But you know, maybe that'll kind of loosen me up for the talking portion of these videos. That's a good color here. Yeah. I think it would be fun to kind of throw some light around Leo's figure here. So show some backlighting on his fedora and trench coat combo. And he's got a big hump here from where his coat is, concealing his turtle shell. Yeah, figuring out how Leo's body would fit underneath a trench coat was kind of interesting. I didn't really look for reference beforehand. Although I did use this action figure here to kind of help rough out the shape of his face from the angle that I chose. Toys and like action figures and cars and stuff like that can come in surprisingly handy when trying to, you know, nail down some perspective on various things. Okay. Let's have a sip of coffee here. This side I'm going to have in yellow. Seems like a nice contrast there. And just kind of winging this, imagining the contours of the jacket in his figure. And we'll see when I lay the inks down if there's anything I feel like I need to add. But probably not. I'm not going to make this too laborious. Okay. So, before I set about making this video, I reached out to the internet for questions that I could ask or that I could answer while I'm recording. So as I continue, I'll get to those. So, when I put out the call for questions, my good buddy Fred Kennedy replied not with a question, but merely stating, "Highlander." I know that Fred is a big Highlander fan. I also like Highlander. So while this isn't a question, it does spark a memory of mine from early working with Fred. Fred is works in radio here in Toronto for formerly 102.1 The Edge, now currently Q107. And Fred and I, for a few years, made an indie comic called Teuton together, about Teutonic Knights in Lithuania. And it was really fun. And in the early days of making our book together, I would go to his place, hang out, we would talk, get shawarma, draw, that type of thing. And he turned on the television and Highlander was on, and he was like, "Yeah, Highlander, this movie rules." And I told him that I much preferred Highlander 2, and like, I saw the life drain from his eyes. So disappointed. Highlander 2 being very unpopular entry in the Highlander franchise. So let's see what my next question was. Big Brian 718 on Instagram asked me, do you start with the backgrounds or people first? Now, by and large, I do start with the figures first when I'm drawing covers or interiors. In this case, however, you can see that I started laying down some markers in the backgrounds initially, but by and large, I'm starting with figures first. They tend to be more fun, so part of it is just me delaying, I guess, what I view as more of a chore than, like the good stuff. So I tend to start with the things that I'm excited about. However, like every rule, there is an exception, and so there are cases where I feel like the background needs some special attention and some forethought. So I'll plan that out and, if necessary, take care of that first before I implement, my figure work. This is a bit of a pain. You can see, similar to like the last cover I did, there is a bit of beading going on, like the ink isn't being quite absorbed by the stock, which I'm not thrilled about, but I'm not necessarily surprised by either. Go. I think I just gotta lay it on pretty well, but I mean it does seem to be taking just a bit of a pain. Actually, let me try something out. I wonder if I would have better luck with one of my synthetic brush pens. Yep, seems to be going on better, so I'm going to change it up and go with this guy for the time being. Okay, so let's get back to the questions here. Boy in a Shirt on Instagram asked me, what's the best advice you can give someone for working on their comic portfolio? And that's a pretty fine question. I remember wondering the same thing, and I've seen a lot of people address this online. There have been some editors who have been pretty good about giving aspiring artists a heads up on what to focus on or what types of things that they can work on and best present to somebody in a portfolio assessment. And when you're drawing comics, you're drawing a whole lot of stuff. You're certainly drawing really fun and cool stuff like action and, pinup style poses and what have you, but you're also drawing a lot of, what might be considered monotonous stuff. You're drawing people in rooms, interacting with furniture or objects. You're drawing, everyday settings like people in a park or people, getting on a train, that type of thing. And that is the type of stuff that can be easily overlooked because you want, there's a natural pull to want to get to the really fun stuff and be adept at showcasing that. And there's nothing wrong, but, a huge percentage of comic book storytelling is, that connective tissue. Before you get to the punches and the explosions and whatnot, you gotta, there's a lot of other stuff that you have to be able to show that tells your story. And that's, things that can be easily ignored, like some of the things that I mentioned just before. So, It's in every artist's best interest when they're working on their portfolio, especially if you're working from a sample script, or I should say, especially when you're working from, pages that you're putting together yourself. Don't forget to, you got to consider your backgrounds. Treat your backgrounds as if they're a character in the story. Treat your buildings and settings as if they're a character in the story, because they are helping tell your story. So don't skimp on those things. And I would say, like anything, it certainly helps to draw from life. So drawing objects that you see in a room or in a kitchen, get comfortable, rendering those things, getting familiar with those types of things, because you'd be surprised at how often you forget what really ordinary and ubiquitous objects look like when you have to think of them in detail. So, you'll always be working in reference or from reference in that regard, but, you want to always be studying life and the world around you, and bring that into your comic book work. I would also suggest, apart from just looking at your comic book heroes and the wonderful work that they've done over their career, I would say it's still important to, look at art from the masters in years past, and be inspired by all types of art, not just comic book art, because you can import so much into your comic book work that you find in other mediums and in life. And then as far as other things that you can do to build your portfolio, I mean, when you're, if you want to be drawing interiors, you want to consider the types of compositions your layouts are being given. Try and make them interesting and dynamic, but also, for scenes that are a little more emotionally involved, you might want to consider something that sells, that focuses on, expressions, and, like, it's okay to get a little simple with those types of scenes. I was also asked by somebody recently, if you're drawing something that's considered a talking head page, like, is it considered boring just to show those talking heads? And yes and no. I've seen some quote-unquote talking head pages that can be really compelling, and I've drawn scenes like that as well, that get in really tight on the characters as they're reading their dialogue, because you're trying to sell an emotion, and that can be really affecting, especially if you execute it well. But you can also make those types of scenes more interesting by showing, kind of like abstract details of the scene that is, that's going on. It doesn't just have to be the heads of those characters in the frame. If you have two people who, say, are sitting down for tea one another and discussing something, you can play with what you're depicting. So you can show, a hand stirring a spoon in a teacup, or, a teacup being held close to the face with steam rising, and that type of thing. So there are certainly ways to make talking head pages, more interesting. I know a lot of artists who will look at talking head pages as, like, finally a break, because they can be drawn a little bit quicker, and monthly comics is a real grind. So anything that could maybe save you a day or two in time can be real welcome. But at the same time, it'll be worth your while to make those pages more interesting than the average person might expect you to draw them. So I hope that answers that question. So in terms of, I guess, just to cycle back to building your comic portfolio, it's more, obviously, keep in mind that it's more editors or writers and stuff are looking for more than just whether or not you can draw a cool character looking badass, or a great looking fight scene. Those things are, obviously they have their place and they can be really important. But most people want to see that you can compose a page in a way that directs the eye, and they want to see whether or not you can draw figures believably in a setting. They want to see that you can draw buildings and like more commonplace stuff. So I would say to focus on that, and part of that is nailing your perspectives and keeping things interesting looking, giving like I said, giving rooms and locations their own sense of character. And it's something I've been guilty of in the past, and I know, and I kick myself for it. Every time I finish a project, I tend to give myself a post-mortem and look at the things that I did and wonder how I could have done them better, and then I carry that with me into the next thing. So I certainly have seen pages of mine where I wish that I had, I may have been trying to get through them because time is always of the essence, but I will come across pages where I think, like, I wish I put a little bit more love into that background or into that building or street scene. So don't shortchange yourself, and I would say think about those things beforehand. It can be really easy when you're laying out pages to just think of the figures and characters first, and then think that you will figure out the background or surroundings on the fly when you're in the middle of the page, and you will almost always shoot yourself in the foot, and you'll always, you will have a better time, and your work will look better if you give that stuff a lot of thought and consideration beforehand. And that's all I can think to say about that. So good luck to you, Boy in Shirt, and everybody else out there who are trying to put together the best comic portfolio that they can. This bit just realized that I said this was like a rainy day, and I haven't really drawn any rain droplets yet, so I should probably consider that as I'm inking. Just a few. I don't need to go overboard. Can just be a light sprinkle as opposed to a torrent. All right, so the next question comes from VDM 2177, which I'm choosing to interpret as Van Damme from the year 2177, which is pretty cool. I'm glad to see that the Van Damme legacy is carrying on so far into the future. And this kind of was close to another question asked by Matt Rowe Art, also on Instagram. And they simply ask, how did you break into comics? And what were some of my early days like? And I've answered these kinds of questions a lot in past podcasts and interviews and what have you. And it really didn't occur to me to bring that up here, but I also realized that, if you're tuning in, it's possible that you don't know much about me personally in terms of like the history of my work so far, or where my roots are. So I guess I can get into a little bit of that as well. But the question of like breaking into comics is always a funny thing, because it's been said elsewhere by people better at answering these things than I am. But the fact of the matter is that there's really no one way to break into comic books. And by break in, most people are referring to how do you get to draw mainstream comic books for either the big two publishers, Marvel and DC, or mainstream comics in general. There's a lot of ways to get work in comic books, and the path that I took is really kind of specific to me in terms of like where my skill level was at when I decided to really give comics a go, and you know, where I was located, the people that I knew, and so forth. So I'm always a little hesitant about trying to give people really specific advice based on my experience, just because I find everybody's story can be tough to replicate. That said, I drew pretty much my entire life. And while I always enjoyed comic books and while I always loved drawing, working in comics wasn't always where I thought I would end up. You know, it's something that I knew that I wanted to do, but for a very long time, it didn't seem like a practical application for, or for art, really. Like when I was coming up, they didn't teach how to get into comics at school. I attended Sheridan College in Oakville, which is known for being a great breeding ground for future illustrators and animators who go on to work for all sorts of publications and studios. So I found that they were pretty great about finding real world applications for your skills, and comic books just wasn't something that got much attention. So I didn't really consider it as a possibility, but that is until I pretty much flamed out of art school because I'm a terrible student, and worked full time for a few years, and made the best of that. I enjoyed working and making money and so on and so forth. But when people would ask me what I wanted to do, I would say that I wanted to make comics, just because, just almost as if I didn't really have anything better to say. Just it seemed like a pretty fitting answer. But quite honestly, for a long time, I didn't really do anything to pursue it. I just kind of, was content to work and make and spend money. And it really wasn't until, I had worked, I was working in a warehouse that I was really unhappy in. And, I just had one of those moments where I had to take a look at my life and ask myself, where are you going? What are you doing? Are you going to get your stuff together or what? And, so when that job kind of concluded, I decided to just make a go for it and, try to find work in the business. And I went about it in an unconventional way. Like I went on to Craigslist to look for comic book jobs. And I, amazingly found a post there where they needed a comic book illustrator. And so that was my first stint, was working on a creator-owned independent graphic novel. And before that, I had drawn like a few pages of my own for fun. I had submitted sample pages to various publishers that were still looking at submissions at that point. A lot of people don't these days. But from there, I connected with somebody that had the means and the interest to put together a book of their own and take that to market at a comic convention. In that case, it was Fan Expo. And once I drew the book and had like a book under my belt, it was better than a CV or a resume, or even really like a portfolio, to be honest. So I could just hand people a comic that they could look at, not necessarily take the time to read. They would just see like, oh, this guy drew this. He can step up and draw an entire graphic novel, and it doesn't look too bad, so I might consider him for my thing. So I connected with a few independent writers in the Toronto scene that needed somebody to draw their stuff. One of those people was my now good buddy, Fred. We connected and started a graphic novel together, and we drew 3 volumes of that for 3 consecutive years. And and in that time, I just got to know people in the Toronto scene. The comic scene in Toronto is, really, really amazing, and there's just it's a real wellspring of talent. It's very robust in that way. There's just a lot of amazing comic artists living in Toronto, coming out of Toronto and Ontario. So I was really lucky that I was in a place where there were a lot of people to connect with and go to. One of those people would be Ty Templeton, who wound up living pretty close to me, and he was offering a course on comic book illustration or making comics, his comic book boot camp, and so I participated in that, and because I was going home and directly applying everything that I was learning, I was able to excel. Ty's a wonderful teacher, and as terrible as a student as I am, he was able to get through to me, and I got a lot out of that. So if you are in the Toronto area, I highly recommend taking one of Ty's courses, because I got a lot out of them, and I can't help but think that somebody else like myself would too. By somebody else like myself, I mean somebody who is ordinarily a terrible student. But even if you're a really good student, it's worthwhile. Anywho, so, and it was just me climbing a ladder where I was doing a lot of independent stuff, connecting with other artists, and, and at that point, it was, like they say, it's, who you know. So I knew some other creators who were rising in the industry and, thought favorably of me and liked my stuff. And so when they needed somebody to, help them on some assignments, they thought of me. And so I got opportunities in that capacity, inking things for other people, being available, I guess kind of like a pinch hitter. And I used those opportunities to, build other opportunities. So pretty soon I found myself in a position where I could contact an editor and show them my work, and ask them to consider me for other gigs. And that's kind of how it all developed. And you find an entry point and you try to cultivate it. You cultivate relationships. You just build and build and build. All the while, you should always be practicing, trying to hone your own skills, trying to get better. And as far as that goes, a real turning point for me in terms of like my level of ability is when I realized that if I wanted to get better, I couldn't just settle for work that I wasn't confident in myself. And by that I mean, sometimes I would draw a page or a cover or a piece, and I would work really hard on it, but then when I would step away from the table and come back to what I was doing, I would see like, this my proportions are a little wonky, or this perspective is sort of screwy and it doesn't look right. And what I realized was, if there was something about the piece that I knew could be better, you know what I mean? That I knew that I would look better if I fixed it, even if it meant redrawing a significant portion of it, then I would do it. I couldn't be precious about, I already invested 6, 7, 8 hours of work into this. If I knew that I screwed up, or I could just, improve on something, and all it would take was just starting over, a willingness to do that, then I started to do it. And I would, my second draft would be much better because I still had all of the information from my first draft, and add with the added bonus of like knowing what I needed to correct. And so once I started fine-tuning my work and becoming a better draftsman and being less precious about salvaging work that, while wasn't perfect, had taken a long time to do, when I was willing to just tear it down and start over, that's when I really started to get better at my craft. So I would say that, like, if you know that you could have done something better, don't make excuses. Don't trick yourself into thinking that because you already spent a lot of time on doing that piece that, it's not worth starting over or going back to. Don't do that to yourself. Like, if you can make it better, and, like, significantly better, then do it. Especially if you want to be considered, for projects, because it's, comics is a world stage. The world is filled with truly skilled and hardworking people. And if you want to work in mainstream comics, then you're in league with them. You're in league with everybody who is being published. So you want to work as hard as they do, if not harder. And you don't want to cheat yourself. So anyhow, that's kind of the broad strokes of how I personally broke into comics. There's many other ways, but I think what's universal for every creator is, putting the work in, being willing to, scrap what what was already difficult to do, being ready to scrap it and do something better, fine tune, refine, and so on and so forth. Because your first try is rarely your best try. So yeah. Okay, so I've got this figure nice and inked. I'm pretty happy with it. Now I'm going to move into some of the background figures and the background itself. It's occurring to me that I should add a touch of color to them as well. So I have people in the background walking around holding umbrellas. So I'm just going to put some splashes of color on those umbrellas that line up with the colors on Leo here. I'm just kind of winging after I've already said not to wing these kinds of things, I'm just kind of winging the outlines, the shapes of these figures. I don't want them, this is supposed to be, simple and suggestive, so I don't want them to take away from Leo in the foreground here. Let's see here. Don Sparrow, who is a lovely illustrator based in Saskatoon. He asked me on Instagram, who is a character everyone loves but you hate? Don, as an aside, also said that his example would be Deadpool as a character that everybody seems to love, but I guess Don does not. And I thought about this, and the truth of the matter is I don't think there's any one character that I really hate, especially in correlation with how many people love them. But to be fair, there aren't many characters that I can say that I truly love. I think depending on who's really behind a character and telling their story, they can be more interesting or less interesting. So I have, and plus I gotta, admit that I am really underread as far as comic books go. There's, there's so much that I haven't read or been exposed to. So, for that reason, I don't think that I have seen enough of any one character to really dislike them or to question their appeal. But I do remember feeling kind of over Deadpool. But I think that was a case of not so much the character itself or the quality of the stories about Deadpool, because whenever I read Deadpool comic books or Deadpool in a comic, um, I, always enjoyed the comic relief that he brought to a story, and still do. I also got to draw Deadpool in an issue of Rocket that I worked on with Al Ewing at Marvel back in, I want to say 2018, 2017. Deadpool appeared in issue 4 of our comic, and I remember when I was informed that Deadpool would be the guest star of that issue, I don't mind admitting that I was perhaps a little underwhelmed, even even bewildered, because we were telling a story set within the cosmic Marvel universe, and I once had a discussion with Al about what types of guest characters I'd ideally would like to see appear in our run on Rocket, and I personally I somebody like the Silver Surfer would have been really exciting to draw. I told Al as much, and Al, in deep in thought, methodically stroked his beard and was like, oh, okay, yeah. So I didn't get Silver Surfer, I got Deadpool, but it wound up being a really fun experience. Like Al is he's a tremendous writer. He's somebody that I like a lot. I'm currently enjoying his Immortal Hulk. But Al was able to imbue Deadpool with this sadness that like I personally hadn't seen from the character before. There may have been some of that before that. Like the most extensive I had ever read Deadpool was probably in Rick Remender's run on Uncanny X-Force, and I don't remember his character being particularly, sad or tragic, but I remember he was in that run a character of some dimension. So, but with what we did in his appearance in Rocket, I found myself moved by the layers that Al was able to bring to Deadpool in that issue, and thought that he played really well with Rocket, especially through the noir lens that we were telling that story through. So this is all to say that at one point I probably would have agreed with Don on Deadpool in principle. But by the end of this monologue, it seems that I'm defending Deadpool. So I apologize, Don. But yeah, to that end, there really isn't a character that I can say that I really dislike. But I do think a big part of that is that I just have not read enough comics to dislike somebody. So maybe in my reading, that'll change if I get to read more. I hope I do. Funny enough, in this quarantine, I've been working quite a bit and not doing as much leisurely reading as I may have promised myself. So I've been a bad boy in that regard. I better make it up to myself. So you can see here I'm just suggesting a face. Okay. Just gonna... Yep, there we go. Okay, one other question is from Kyle J. Griffin. What was my favorite comic to illustrate? So I already talked a bit about really enjoying drawing Rocket, my first ever work at Marvel Comics. In particular, the 4th issue, which was probably my favorite issue in that series. But my favorite job in comics probably was not an interior gig, but a cover gig. Over the course of 2018 and 19, I got to pencil and ink covers for Jughead the Hunger, written by Frank Thierry, and collaborate with my buddy Joshua Hickson, who did the color art for those covers. That was really tremendously fun. I really enjoyed doing them. I sincerely hope that I get to do more if the series comes back. If we ever stop being in quarantine and there are still comic books being published in the future, I certainly hope that a second volume of Jughead the Hunger is one of them, and that I return to draw covers for it. Just drawing werewolves in itself is really fun. Jughead being a werewolf is a really fun spin on the character. I got to display, I guess, my horror chops doing those covers, and then working with Josh. Josh is a terrific comic illustrator in his own right, so I was very lucky that he was willing to collaborate with me doing the color art for it. He colors a lot of his own stuff, or I think he colors all his own stuff, and he just has this really terrific palette and color sense that he brought to all of those pieces, and they would not have been the same without him. And so every cover was a blast to do, and working with Josh was truly fun. That was, that stands out to me as one of my favorite jobs in comics. And then apart from that, I got to draw a couple of issues of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Universe, and that was really fun, in part because I had worked on the Turtles a little bit before then. I had inked an issue of a crossover between the Turtles and the X-Files at IDW, and I did some cover work for the Turtles after that, and I really enjoyed it. I got asked if I would do this 2-issue story in universe where I got to work with Ryan Ferrier, who is a really great writer from Canada. And so, he had this really fun science fiction story about Metalhead and Donatello. So it was really, Donatello had been killed in a previous issue at the hands of Bebop and Rocksteady, but his consciousness had been uploaded into Metalhead. And so, when Don was returned to his body and he was fixing Metalhead, discovered that, a backup of his consciousness was still in Metalhead. And so, it was this really compelling story about identity and artificial intelligence and acceptance. And I thought that Ryan did a really terrific job on the scripts, and it was really fun getting to create a new villain for the Ninja Turtles universe, Metalhead 2.0. And then just in drawing the characters, basically rediscovered my childhood love for the Ninja Turtles. Like a lot of kids growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was a big fan of the Turtles and loved the movies, loved the cartoons, had a ton of action figures and so on. I definitely had Turtles fever. And, I guess kind of forgot that. And so drawing that little duology really brought that back, and I'm happy it did. So that stands out as a job that I just had a lot of fun with. And then my editor Bobby at IDW was really great, continues to be really great. So sometimes what makes a job worthwhile are the relationships that you create on the job. And then apart from that, drawing Punk Mambo at Valiant has been a really terrific experience. She is a character that I was not familiar with when I was given the assignment, but became really, really fun because I got to discover this character through Cullen's scripts, Cullen Bunn writing, and bond with her in a manner of speaking, and in part make her my own. And that was really, really really worthwhile. Continues to be, as I am currently working on a second volume of that series back with Cullen. Part of what makes that experience worthwhile is, the people at Valiant are, again, terrific to work with. I really like my collaborators, and I think that the stories that we're telling are super fun. Okay. So, for the background, I want it to look a little distant and rainy. Not too refined, not too sharp. Again, because I want the city lights and everything to recede from our characters here. So this is a bit of an experiment, and I played around earlier on a scrap piece of paper, but I'm going to be using a Q-tip to fill in our background here. So kind of like dry brushing, I guess. I haven't really done this before, but I'm intrigued to try it. So let's see how it goes. See if I can get that drier, because I really want it to look kind of scraped on. So as I do this, I will answer the final question that I had written down. I took these questions a little beforehand and had meant to answer them much sooner, because I had meant to record much sooner, but life just kind of got away from me for a couple of days. So my buddy Mike Walsh asked me, he asked me a number of silly things, but he did me a solid and asked me for real serious questions. So thank you, Michael. And he asked me, basically, if I wasn't restrained by budget, or anything like that, like what is the project, what is the book that I would want to fully invest writing and drawing myself, whether it be creator owned, whether it be my take on a character or franchise or whatever. So it's a really fun question, and something that I know has been on Michael's mind, who, Michael is one of my comic book heroes. He's a contemporary of mine, but he's also somebody that I greatly admire. He has a tremendous, work ethic on top of being, skilled. He is just somebody that I take a lot of notes from. So, my relationship with him has been really beneficial, on top of rewarding, because it's nice to have a friend. Anyhow, he's been making tremendous strides in realizing his own projects, things that he wants to bring into the world. And he seems to be having a tremendous lot of fun doing that, and seems like a really gratifying pursuit. So not surprising that that's on his mind. As for myself, there's like a ton of stuff that I would like to do. Like story ideas pop into my head all of the time. Not fully formed stories, just kind of nuggets of ideas. But then there's also projects that I could see myself taking on and putting my signature on. And So one thing that I've always really wanted to do is adapt a novel into a graphic novel. In particular, I grew up. Well, I didn't grow up. At a certain when I discovered Kurt Vonnegut, I devoured pretty much everything that he wrote and felt like some of his works could translate really well to graphic novels. And so he has a couple of stories that I think are evergreen in terms of their themes and what they're saying about our world. Because a lot of what he felt and expressed in his writing is still quite relevant, and in some cases more so than ever. And so I think, taking a stab at adapting a book that I love and got a lot out of, and introducing potentially a new audience to those works would be a tremendous bit of fun. And apart from Vonnegut, I had thought about doing an adaptation of Arthur C. Clarke's Odyssey series, so 2001, 2010. I think the third book is 2061, if memory serves, and then 3001. Those are all books that I've read and enjoyed. But one thing that is really interesting about them is that, the first book was written in tandem with the film being made. But there, are discrepancies. I believe that in the book, it's the planet that the astronauts are approaching is Saturn, whereas in the movie it was Jupiter. Or maybe I have that backwards. I might have that backwards. But I know that in each installment of the Odyssey series, there's a bit of retconning going on. So in 2010's case, I know that Arthur C. Clarke retconned it so the movie that the planet in the book aligned with the planet in the movie. And that's just one example of changes that he made throughout. So I thought it would be fun to do an adaptation that kind of is a bit more unified in terms of the details, but also showcases some of the things that get mentioned in the books, especially the first book that didn't make it into the movie, or I should say was either, suggested or, shown in a way that wasn't so, matter of fact. But I found out maybe a few years after that there was a 2001 comic adaptation by, the king of comics himself, Jack Kirby. And I picked up an issue of that, and of course it's like super crazy, really fun, does a lot of things that the book doesn't even really get into. So it's super, super wild. So that's something that I've had to think twice on pursuing, because I just, I don't think that there's any topping Kirby in that arena. And then there's personal stories that I'd like to tell, some short stories, some longer stories that are crime-based, horror-based, I guess genre stories, for lack of a better term. But yeah, and then there's a variety of sketchbooks that I would like to put out. Some of them more like travelogues than anything else. There's a book I'd like to put together about my time spent volunteering on various paleontological digs in the Badlands of Montana. So there's stuff there that I felt like would be really, really fulfilling to examine and showcase in art in a graphic novel form. So that's something that I'd like to do. Oh, I think my 4-year-old is awake. Anyhow, okay, so I got most of that pretty much what I thought it was going to be. just feels a little blank. So as an experiment, that was fine. I don't know if it gives me anything wildly different from I could have got from a dry brush, but I thought I would give it a shot. So, and you got to see it happen. Woohoo! Just fill this in further. Okay, let's see here. Let me just grab a white gel pen. We'll just add some rain here. That stark white really pops, okay? I guess that's what we want. This kind of has a Will Eisner Spirit vibe with the blue mask and the top hat and the rain. I'm now realizing. Not to compare myself to the late great Will Eisner, but I guess I am. I guess I'm pretty great. Okay, let's try to... There we go. With these gel pens, like they're really great for detail work, like highlighting certain things, so they're really terrific, but they don't... And in this case, I actually guess it's a benefit, but they aren't the best for long lines. They don't have the kind of flow I would need for that. But the way it's kind of breaking up is actually working in my favor, so I'm not going to complain. Now, rain is... You want to suggest it, but you don't necessarily want to overdo it, and you want to kind of make it appear a little random. So the best way to do that is to not really think about where you're putting all of the lines, while at the same time are being careful in, how you're moving your hand around, because you want it to look, randomized yet purposeful. And let's see here. There we go. All right. Okay, well, I think that about does it. Okay, last thing I got to do is sign this puppy. There we are. We're done. So thank you for watching. Thank you to everybody that answered my call for questions. I'm sorry that I Didn't get to every question that was asked of me online, but I'll probably do the same thing again for future recordings. So feel free to ask the same question or anything new that pops into your head. Feel free to share. As always, if you're looking to get a commission from me, you can contact my rep Cam at inkyknuckles.com or visit inkyknuckles.com for for inquiries. And feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Adam T. Gorham, Gorham, for pretty much daily content. All right. Thanks again. Take care. Bye.